Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto is teaching in this book, The Path of the Just, about a concept of elevating yourself to the highest level of righteousness. He says that a person, no matter who you are, can become a tzaddik. A tzaddik is a person who is really righteous. He says this tzaddik is a person who not only does what is required by Torah, by the laws of God, but exceeds them in every aspect of their life. Talks about doing it with watchfulness and zeal and care, attention to detail. And then we get toward the end of the book and he's saying, humility is something that can be grasped, but it is something that must be worked on gradually. There are two concepts, he says, to acquire biblical humility. One is through training and the other through contemplation. The training aspect of humility means that you start easy, achieve little things at a time. We talked about humility and the practice of humility by simply preferring others above yourself. Very simple concept. But this translates into your daily life, what you do at the store, how you operate your car in the traffic. All of these things are characters of humility in which you always prefer the other person over yourself. When it comes to being in places of honor, a person who is practicing or training themselves in humility will intentionally, even though they deserve a place of honor, will lower the expectation. One of the great stories that we like to hear is about the elderly man who is seen at the shul, and after the shul, the rabbi invites him to his house to have dinner with him. And at the dinner, the rabbi asked him, would you like to do a shiur, a lecture on a part of the portion? He said, well, certainly I will. And he does a lecture, but he gives no credit to where the lecture comes from. The rabbi gets a bit upset. He says, if he does it again, I'm going to tell him that he should. Because in Judaism, we know that when you cite a source or give a lecture on something from Torah, you always tell where you heard it from. Even if you didn't hear it from Rabbi Nachman himself, but I heard it from Rabbi Greenbaum or a friend, you always give credit to that because it's a mitzvah. It's an act of great respect to the teacher. And so the next time he teaches, does the same thing, does the whole shiur, almost word for word. The rabbi says, you know what, I've had enough of this. I'm going to tell him. Picks the book out of the shelf, opens it up. He says, this is word for word in this book right here. Word for word. You stole it out of it and didn't give the author credit. He goes, I'd look better on paper, don't I? The author was the guy who was given the shiur. He's so humble that he didn't say, oh, in my book, I wrote this. He didn't say it. So this is what we're talking about. So the next aspect is the contemplation. The contemplation of anava, or humility, means that this person and we should spend time thinking about what humility actually means and whether we are humble in our intent. One can do acts of humility, act humble, and really not have a humble heart. So you understand, they can be prideful about their humility. That sounds crazy, but they can do humble acts to bring them credit, but in reality, in their mind, they still have a strong ego. So what we need to ask ourselves, and this is really what happens in reflection and prayer to Hashem, to God, is you say, God, illuminate areas in my life that I am really not very humble, I'm very prideful in. And there is a phrase that I think my wife quoted, says, when you are insulted and hurt, it means that you're prideful. It's like your ego gets busted. So if you ever get insulted or hurt, the first thing you should ask, you know what, if I was a little bit more humble, maybe this wouldn't have insulted me so much. I mean, this is contemplation. So he talks about in contemplation some ideas to contemplate. Number one is consider where you've come from, right? He says, remember that you were nothing and you came into this world as a drop of fluid, and when you die, you leave and the worms are going to eat you. Consider where you came from. Next, yes, go ahead.
I read something somewhere that said when we get to thinking too much of ourselves,
Mhm.
just remember the gnat was created before we were.
Yeah, the gnat was created before we were. Absolutely. And that is part of knowing where you came from. Exactly. There's debate among the sages of blessed memory who say, well, why was man created at the end of 7 days, not at the beginning of creation? And one idea says, well, man was created at the end so that all creation was there in place for him to enjoy. It was like a tank to be built in. The other one says, no, he was created last because this was to constantly remind him that he wasn't number one. And it humbles him. So it is a way to think of that. If the first thing in contemplation is know where you've come from, the second part is know where you're going. This idea is reflected in this idea that where I'm heading to at the end of days is going to actually meet the Maker. I'm going to have to stand before the King of Kings. I know where I've come from, now I know where I'm going. And if we spend our life considering what is going to be the end for us, we've often said that our epitaphs that are written on our grave markers doesn't ever really say, hey, I made X amount of dollars, or I had 2,000 friends on my Facebook page. No one really cares about that. And as a matter of fact, the day you take your last breath, you're not going to be thinking about all of your accomplishments. You're going to be thinking about meeting your Maker. That is a serious thing. That is why this idea of contemplating humility, if I've contemplated humility and I know where I'm going, and I have an idea where I'm going, that humbles me to say, whatever I do in this life counts. It counts what I do in this life. And why does it count? Because one day I'll stand before the one who will make me accountable for my actions. And if I have been a humble person, we know that God will look kindly upon my humility. Scripture says that he lifts up the humble and debases the proud. There are four areas of, There are four areas of contemplation that lead to avana. And I'm going to quickly cover these four areas and then we're going to move on. Second area of contemplation is a matter of unpredictable consequences of time and their many variations. For example, a healthy person becomes sick all of a sudden. That's a good way to humble you, right? A person of great wealth, all of a sudden the stock market falls and they lose millions of dollars. That's a humbling event. That is part of the contemplation of this whole thing, is recognizing, you know what? I am doing well. How are you doing? Come on in. Come on in. You want to see if you can help her? So the second area of this idea is that keep in mind that your circumstance could change. Therefore, not to become proud about where you're at the time. Maybe you've accomplished a lot. Maybe you've done quite amazing things in your life, but realize your circumstance could change overnight and you can be left completely destitute. That is part of also the contemplation. Here's a third area. When a person contemplates his obligation to Hashem, blessed be He, and the extent to which he has neglected his relationship with Hashem, and how lax he has been in regard with it to perform it, he certainly will be ashamed and not filled with pride. The idea is having the mindset that I am not all of that when it comes to my learning and my mitzvahs. That God holds us to a high standard, but yet I realize I've got a long ways to go. Who would ever think of them? I can't imagine even a great expert of Torah Judaism would stand before someone and declare that they're an expert. Why? Because they're humble. The more Torah you study, the more humble you become. The second part of that is naturally when you study the Torah, naturally when you begin to do mitzvahs, it humbles you even more because you realize how much further you have to go. Sort of reminds me of a person who is a great athlete. You know, they perform amazing feats in their athletic prowess. You ask them about their expertise and how good they are in the sport, and they will, yes, know they've made great accomplishments, but they work themselves as if they don't have any abilities. You understand? They break their bodies, they work their bodies, they push their bodies. The same thing is for us. When we practice Avinah in contemplation, we're actually working on our lives daily to press through and to know that I'm going to be accountable to Hashem. Now, let's look at the factors which detract from humility. The Ramchal says that, on the other hand, among the factors that detract from this trait of humility is abundance and satiations in the benefits of this world. Deuteronomy, the 8th chapter, verse 12 to 14 says this: "Lest you eat and be satisfied, and you build good houses, and settle your cattle and sheep and goats, increase your increase of silver and gold for yourself, and everything that you have will increase," it says, "and your heart will become haughty, and you will forget Hashem your God. It is for this reason that pious people found it to be good for a person to occasionally deprive himself of material needs." Why? To avoid haughtiness. As we all know, it's easy to become full of pride when you have everything and when you're an expert in everything. And so it says that the sages of blessed memory, those who are tzaddikim, or righteous men and women, they deprive themselves. Many times, if you'll go into the Orthodox community, what you're going to find is people that live very meager lives. They don't drive fancy cars. Many of them don't even have cars. They walk to wherever they go. I heard Rabbi Mizrahi say of a great Chacham in New York, you go to his house and he's like a giant in the community in Torah knowledge, and they are sitting on milk cartons for chairs around the table. And they say, "Why don't you get chairs?" He goes, "I don't need chairs. I have chairs. Why do I need to buy chairs? I have milk cartons." He's very happy, very, very satisfied with his meager existence. It doesn't mean that a person who is poor has more humility. Okay? A poor person can be very prideful and full of their ego. But we're talking about being satisfied with your life. Having established the external conditions that undermine Avinah, the Ramchal focuses on an internal factor that impairs this trait. So if the external factor that inhibits humility is materialism and consumption and obsession with things, then there's an internal factor that is just as important for us to consider. Just as there's a training aspect and contemplation aspect to learning and training yourself humility, we're going to see some internal things that need to be dealt with. Second, first thing it says, "Now at the forefront of all impediments to humility is ignorance and deficiency of true knowledge of Torah." Let me say that again. He says the forefront, at the very front of the impediments to having humility, is ignorance and deficiency in true knowledge of Torah. I was just expressing to someone last night in the community that Torah almost becomes the knowledge of Torah, true Torah wisdom. It changes your sort of spiritual metabolic system. I can't even explain it. It changes you without you trying for it to change you. It changes you. It's almost like I just spent 2 weeks taking antibiotics, right? You see, what's the benefit of this nasty tasting white pill? And as you take it, you slowly but surely, all your symptoms begin to go away without you doing any additional thing, taking the tablet. The Torah and the study of Torah is the same way. One doesn't have to try to be a humble person when you know Torah, because Torah will humble you. You don't have to guard your mouth and not speak evil speech against a person and gossip. You'll never have to struggle with that again if you know Torah, because it is the fear of God that is the beginning of wisdom. And if the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, then I need to know everything I need to know about the character and nature of the Creator of the universe. How do I know that? Well, it's not because of what some guy tells me. It's what God says in His Torah. And I love this phrase that Rabbi Tovia Singer always says. It's not important what you and I think or what you and I say. We want to know, what does God say? That's important. with that, it says, for you will see that haughtiness is more prevalent, specifically in those who are ignorant. Have you ever heard the phrase, ignorance is bliss? Okay. Why is it bliss for the haughty? It's because they're ignorant. They can be haughty because they don't know any different, right? They're just ignorant. In this vein, the sages of blessed memory said in Sanhedrin 24a, this, a symptom of haughtiness is poverty of Torah. What does the great prophet say? That in the days before Mashiach, that there will be a famine in the land, not of food, but of Torah. People will not know the Torah. We're living in that day right now. A single coin in a pitcher makes a lot of noise. A single coin in a pitcher makes a lot of noise. Now, what does he mean by this? The person who's often the loudest, most vocal, bloviating, haughty individual is empty inside. They have just enough wisdom to make a lot of noise, right? Like clinking around a box of donations. Makes a lot of noise, but there's nothing in it. If you have a box of donation and it's full to the top, shake it, it doesn't make any noise. So a person, the more wise he becomes, the more humble he becomes, or she becomes, the more quieted they become, and the more focused they become in the world. Does that make sense? They're not making a lot of noise. It says that a fool is all. Fruit trees, by contrast, are valued for their fruit and need not to make noise to be noticed. So here's the counter to this idea that a coin in a box has little value. But fruit trees doesn't need to boast about its fruit. It doesn't need to make noise because it's evident. You see it on the tree. So a person that's humble is a person, you see the characteristics and the traits of humility on them. It's just all over them. You don't have to broadcast and tell people, I'm so humble. I'm so humble. I love myself. I'm so humble. All right? Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses himself, who's the choicest of mankind, supreme in his knowledge of Torah, was also the humblest of all mankind. Bidmidbar 12:3. Another factor that impedes humility, an additional factor that detracts from humility, is the association with or the employment of people who are flatterers in order to win over another individual with flattery, so that he may be of some benefit to them, will praise him and exalt him by exaggerating extreme virtues and by even ascribing to him additional virtues that he entirely lacks. In fact, at times, the qualities that he does have are the opposite of the ones that they praise him for. So what is being said? Here's another one. If you're in an environment where everybody's giving you attaboy, slaps on the back, and you're the greatest, and always telling you how wonderful you are and that you're an amazing person, flattery can be empty, and it can produce pride in your life. Especially, I come from a military background, and awards are very big. Excuse me, I'm just at sneeze. I usually do 4, but I'm going to press it out. Okay. Edit that out. Whew. Military. I was in the military, and one of the greatest things that they have is award systems. You do something brave, you do something out of your normal line of duty, you go above and beyond the call of duty, you're going to be rewarded. You get these medals that you bear on your chest. When I was a police officer, if you did some heroic thing, you would be recognized and possibly get a letter of commendation from the chief of police and mayor. Those kinds of situations can be an impediment to humility. Can very much be an impediment to humility. Let's look at an illustration of the dangers of flattery. we hear of an incident of Jehoash, the king of Judah, who performed good deeds all the days his teacher, Jehoiada, the Cohen, guided him. But after the death of the Cohen, the teacher, his servants came and began to flatter him and exaggerate to the point that they defined him, and then the king took heed to them. Those words of flattery took heed. He allowed himself to be defiled, and as a result, he allowed idolatry to flourish in the kingdom of Israel. Thus his downfall was a direct result of his servants flattering him, telling him he can do no wrong. Our postmodern society is the most ego-driven society in the world, especially with, social media. People love to put selfies up, and they take the most flattering pictures, and they speak of themselves in the most flattering way. That is a byproduct of parents who have raised their children in the last 25 years, I think, about somewhere around there, who do nothing but heap praises on their children. They're always the best. They can do no harm. They can do no wrong. Even if they try to accomplish something and they fail, they're not told they failed at it. They tell them, no, you're the best. You can do anything. You can be anything you want to be. Now, those are great comments. But stroking a child's ego their entire life produces a stronger ego and a lack of humility. That's why a teenager goes to get a job nowadays, and what one of the chief complaints of CEOs and employers and HR people in the world, in America, is dealing with children or young people who have an inflated value of themselves. They think they're much better than what they really are. And when they are provided a critique from their bosses, they go out of their mind. And in one incident, as in yesterday, the news reporter who was shot and killed by another news reporter is the prime example. This guy left one job after another job, could not take criticism, and always blamed somebody else for the problem. And eventually he lost his mind and killed some people. God forbid that would ever happen again. So, with that being said, we understand that there is, we all love compliments, right? We all people like to hear, you're doing a good job. We're not talking about that. We're talking about almost a pathological level of heaping comments and compliments on people. It's good to keep yourself in perspective. The Ramchal concludes with a description of a kind of a friend a person should choose. Now, the Ramchal says that your friends are really important. If you have friends that are truthful to you, that's better than a friend who constantly heap praises on you and is not honest with you about their summation. He says, in this regard, there is nothing better for a person than to seek a friend of integrity who will open his eyes to which he is blind, and who, when he sins, errs, will admonish him out of love for him, thereby saving him from evil. This is because whenever a person cannot see on his own, since one does not see his own faults, they will see and understand, and they will warn him to improve him of ways that he will protect himself or be protected from danger. In Mishliach 24:6 and Psalm 24:6, it says that, and salvation is an abundant counsel. By seeking the counsel of men of integrity, one saves himself from his own faults. The term Adam and Eve, it says that God made Eve as a helpmate, but the real translation to that Hebrew, instead of being a helpmate, is one who, what's the proper way of saying it? Prods? Opposes. Eve was created as an opposer to Adam. What does that mean? Why an opposer? Well, if you've been married very long, you know that at first you're Twitter-pated and consumed with love for your spouse, and you're in love with them, and they could do no wrong. Then one day you wake up and you realize you're totally opposites. Total, complete opposites in the relationship. where one likes the crust on the bread, the other one likes the soft tissue of the bread, right? It's weird. But your spouse, and we learn from Torah Judaism that your spouse is supposed to prod you and is supposed to be the person who prods you to higher levels. Now, I've often said that a wife can destroy a husband or make him a great man. One of the two things. The prodding has to be toward righteousness and toward goodness. And most definitely, my wife prods me to goodness. She helps to see the blind spots that I don't see. And it's important, very important. And vice versa, a husband should be able to do the same. Let's summarize this chapter. It says a person can bring himself to inner humility in two ways. One, by gradually adopting the practices of humility. Two, by contemplating certain truths and images that diminish one's pride. Among these contemplations are man's humble physical origins, his degrading physical end, and the fearsome circumstances of his final judgment. The fickle nature of fortune, one's debt to Hashem, in light of one's many sins, and the weakness of his intellect. The factors that inhibit, we talked about that which builds up humility. Now we're going to sum up to see what inhibits one's attainment of humility are material excesses, ignorance of Torah, and association with flatterers. Bottom line. So how do you want to develop humility? Hang around people that are humble people. That's how. Pretty simple. Doesn't seem to be too over the top. Very much common sense. But the Ramchal says in his introduction of this book that you're not going to hear anything that you don't know. Right? All this stuff makes good common sense. Like when you hear it, it makes good sense that you would do this. What we're finding out is the Ramchal takes and condenses all of these ideas down to very succinct concepts that change your life. Next chapter is chapter 24, and we will continue next week on the trait of yiras, or yiras chet, or the fear of sin. The fear of sin. Questions?